Hey home bakers, I hope you are well. It's the beginning of another year and I thought for those of you who are new, it might be a nice way to introduce you to homemade bread, and for those of you who are not new, it might be a nice refresh to see the 2019 Yeasted Bread Back to Basics trilogy. You'll see me struggle with that sentence a few times during this video in one compilation video start to finish. It's a three-parter. The first part we speak about the ingredients that we use in our homemade bread. In the second part, those all-important principles we talk about a lot on this channel. And the third part, we go in depth into the process of a yeasted straight dough start to finish. I hope all that made sense. Let's cut to me in the old school studio in 2019. Roll that theme tune. You will find a few recipes here start to finish, but most of what I do is try and share with you the knowledge that you need, because knowledge and experience and practice is way more powerful than a recipe by itself. That's what we tackle here at Bake with Jack. So without further ado, let's talk about part one of this three-part Yeasted Bread Back to Basics series. Part one is all about ingredients, and just hold on. You know we're getting serious when the kids' chalkboard comes out. Yes! Okay, here we are. When you're making yeasted breads at home, your ingredients fall into three categories: basic ingredients, extras, and what we will now call bits and bobs. So let's go through each one of these categories together and see what we can discover. Category number one, basics. This is what your bread dough is made out of. 4 ingredients: flour, salt, water, and yeast. 4 basic ingredients that are essential for your bread dough. Well, let's keep this simple with the top one: flour. Your basic foundation for yeasted bread at home is strong white bread flour. You can make a lovely white loaf of bread with 100% strong white bread flour. You're going to need around about ½ kilo for your dough to make a nice loaf of bread. The other one we're going to tackle today is brown flour, which is the opposite to white. It's brown flour, it's wholemeal, it's whole grain, whatever you want to call it, it's brown. White and brown. These two are pretty much interchangeable in terms of the properties of the dough will stay the same there or thereabouts. The only thing you've got to consider is the more brown flour you're going to need, the more water you're going to need, because everything will get a little bit tighter. And so for a loaf of bread for a beginner, if you were to use all white flour, you're looking around about 63-65% hydration, which will make a dough that I consider to be quite manageable. On the other end of the scale, if you're using 100% brown flour, which you can do, the bread itself is going to be heavier. It's going to be heavier than white bread alone. That's just the nature of it. You're going to need a little bit more moisture, and we're looking at working around about 70% hydration if you're using 100%. If you want to mix them up and do 50-50, you can do that absolutely fine and cut the water somewhere between the 2 hydration rates. Does that make sense? Feel free to have a play and experiment with those 2 flours. Quite a nice loaf that I do in class is 80% white flour and 20% wholemeal flour. And I feel like that's a real nice balance. You get the flavour from the wholemeal and you get the lightness from the white, and that's just the way that I'd like it. So with these 2 flours you can have a play and you can't really go too badly wrong. When we get into speciality flour territory, I'm talking about rye, spelt, that sort of thing. These things change the texture of your dough much more, and so it's not as easy just to swap out one for another in that scenario. Things get a little bit more tricky. Let's move on. The next ingredient on my list is water. Water is important because without it your bread's going to be a little bit dry. Seriously, water brings everything together, right? Water is the key ingredient. The more water you have in your recipe, the slacker your dough is going to be. The less water you have in your recipe, the tighter your dough is going to be. And that's okay. Theoretically, the rule is the wetter the dough, the better the bread is going to be in terms of keeping quality, in terms of flavour, in terms of fermentation, in terms of moisture of the crumb. The bread is going to be better the wetter the dough is. However, if you can't manage a wet dough, don't do it wet. Do it drier. Take the moisture down in your recipe for next time to make it more manageable for yourself. Water's important. I get it out of the tap and use it for my bread dough. Room temperature is quite key depending on where you are on the planet, and I will link in the description below a couple of blog posts that I wrote about the temperature and how important it is. Salt is important. I use fine sea salt in my recipe. Salt is important. If you make bread without salt, one, it doesn't taste of anything. It's the weirdest sensation to put bread in your mouth that doesn't taste like bread. Salt is really important in terms of flavour. Also, if you make it without salt, things get a bit crumbly, hard to slice. I've done it, we've all done it by accident. Come on, it's hard to slice the bread. Things get a bit crumbly. The structure doesn't quite develop properly. It's all a little bit strange. Put salt in, it's important. As a rule, I used to do 10 grams for half a kilo of flour, and now I've cut it down to 8 grams for half a kilo of flour, which I don't find compromises the flavour much. Next up, yeast. Yeast is responsible for puff. Yeast is responsible for creating the gas that puffs up our dough. Yeast ferments the dough, creating two things. One, gas, which is puff, and two, flavour. Yeast comes in fresh forms and dry forms, and let's take a look at them both, shall we? This is what fresh yeast looks like. It comes in a cube and it's fresh, and we keep it in the fridge. I keep it in a box like this, lined with the paper that it came in. It's like this. It's a little bit crumbly. It's really, really lovely for a loaf of bread. For this, for example, I'll use half a kilo of flour and, as a rule, 12 grams of fresh yeast. Fresh yeast brings incredible flavour and incredible texture, which I do not believe is present when you make a bread with dry yeast. If you can't get hold of fresh yeast, please don't let that be a barrier to you making amazing bread at home. There is dry yeast that you can get in two different varieties. This one is called Easy Bake, or sometimes it's called Fast Action, Quick, Instant, Easy Blend Yeast, and it's a really fine powdered type of dry yeast. Can you see that? Hold on, beep, that's better. See that? This one is really fine one. There's another one that I can't show you, I'm afraid, and that's granules. It comes in the same tin like this, but it is granules. The particles are a little bit bigger and they require dissolving in water before you put it into your dough. This one, straight into the flour. See you later. As a rule, for dry yeast, for a yeasted loaf of half a kilo of flour, I'd go with about 7 grams. And this quite helpfully comes in a 7 gram sachet, so you can use 1 sachet per loaf if you want to. I do have a few issues with this yeast. First and foremost, yeast, the fresh one that you get, is just yeast. This one has got all sorts of bits and bobs that I could try and read and embarrass myself inside, but I'm not going to do it. Sorbitan monosterate, what is that? Is that normal? I don't know. Who knows? Which brings us on to the next category. This is exciting, isn't it? Extras. Extra number 1 is fat. Don't be afraid of the word fat. It's not a bad word. I'm talking about things like butter. I'm talking about things like oil, sometimes even lard. Fat in our dough brings softness and silkiness. It also brings flavour as well. Imagine a buttery brioche, for example, with a buttery flavour. A focaccia using olive oil, bringing the beautiful fragrance of olive oil to your finished bread. Also, as an extra added bonus, fat keeps the moisture into your bread for longer, therefore bringing it more shelf life. It makes the final bread softer and the finer bread moister, which enables it to last a little bit longer. Moving on, eggs. Eggs have got fat inside, right? Eggs have got fat inside, they bring softness, so they also bring lift. If you imagine an omelette, if you're cooking an omelette and then you put it on the grill for a bit and forget about it, and it big puffs up like a giant souffle, right? This is what I imagine has happened inside of our bread. Whether that happens or not, who knows, who cares? I'm not a scientist, but that's how it makes sense in my brain. Egg brings lift. If you make a nice sweet dough for a nice iced bun, for example, egg brings lift. Fat is there to keep it nice and soft, and the egg brings additional puff, making your bread lighter. Breads like brioche have a high portion of the water replaced with egg, and that's why it rises up so nice and soft, exactly like a panettone, for example. Milk is lovely too. Obviously there's fat in milk, and it brings a nice silkiness and a nice milky flavour to your final bread as well. If you make a bread with just milk instead of water, it brings a lovely, wonderful lightness and softness that wouldn't be there present otherwise. Now, if you're excited by category number 2, get a load of the bits and bobs category. Let's do the big reveal. Bang! Actually, you probably can't see that very well, can you? This bits and bobs category is everything I consider to be speciality ingredients, things that you fancy. Your imagination comes into play here. I'm talking about nuts, seeds, dry fruit, olives, cheese. I can't even read it. I wrote olives twice. What's that about? Chocolate. These are all the flavours, the things that bring flavour and the things that bring texture to an olive loaf or a sun-dried tomato bread. Stuff like this. Extra bits and bobs that you want to add to make it your own. I'm talking about a brioche compared to a chocolate brioche with chocolate drops inside. Hello, a wholemeal bloomer with apricots and pecan nuts ready for your cheese board. Things you want to add to your dough, things you want to put onto your dough, all these bits and bobs, that's up to you. You can use your imagination to a certain extent. Some things are not practical, but you'll find that out. Think of adding herbs to your dough to bring a nice fragrance. Think of adding little cubes of cheese, little molten bits of cheese inside of a loaf of bread. Wow. Steer clear of anything that might be a little bit too wet. Also, raw vegetables a lot of the time are a little bit iffy. If you imagine anything inside of your dough is effectively steaming itself inside the dough as the bread bakes, you want to sort of avoid raw things like raw onions, for example. I think that would be gross. I'd rather slowly cook those onions, releasing the natural sweetness before I incorporated it into my dough to bring a nice, sweet, cooked, delicious onion flavour as opposed to a steam, raw, slightly acidic. No, not feeling it. These, to summarise, are your basic ingredients for your yeasted loaf of bread. Flour, salt, water, yeast, they are essential. Essential. Extra things, fat, eggs, milk, I'm talking about oil and butter. These things bring new elements, new dynamics, new textures, new lightness. They open doors of new deliciousness inside of your bread dough. And these things that you want to add, well, that's just up to you, whether it's chocolate and hazelnut. Oh, man. Slow roasted cubes of sweet butternut squash, whatever it is that you fancy you want to have a play with, that's those things there. Okay, this is part 2 of a 3-part series. Last week we spoke about ingredients, the basic ingredients categorized into nice categories for your yeasted bread. Part 3 next week will be the process, the steps and the stages that you need to go through in order to make a nice loaf or nice rolls or whatever. But it would be wrong for me to go there without talking about the principles of homemade bread, because you know how we do it here at Bakery Jack. You know it. We deal with principles. We deal with some recipes. Yeah, there's some recipes, but we deal with principles because principle is where the true power lies. Principle will give you the power to come up with your own stuff and make your own way and make it fit in with your own schedule. Principles will give you the knowledge that you need so that if you do a recipe and it goes wrong, you know exactly why it went wrong and you're not left clueless, just searching in the dark. Principles are power, and without further ado, let's get the chalkboard up and go through the top 4 principles you need to know when you're making bread at home. Oh, I should have done this earlier. Okay, here we are. There are 4 key principles at play when you are making bread successfully at home. Let's go through them one by one. Principle number 1 is strength. The strength within your dough, and this is down to gluten. Gluten are the elastic bands inside of your dough that knit the whole structure together. Gluten is the thing that gives it that elasticity, that bounce, that snapback, and with that bounce and elasticity, things are going to rise up really nicely when the yeast does its work and makes bubbles. Strength is the thing that holds all those bubbles inside of the dough, and your dough will rise up nice and tall and proud, both in the first rising stage, and in the second when you bake it. The strength and elasticity in your dough is developed with two things. One is work and the other one is rest. Working your dough, kneading it in the beginning stages, that physical labour is what develops the gluten, the elasticity and the strength of your dough. When you are resting your dough, when your dough is soaking in the moisture, that gluten and everything develops even further while you do nothing. Strength is key, because without strength in your dough, it ain't gonna puff up properly. Let's move on to principle number 2. Puff. Puff is the name of the game. Call it what you want. Call it rise, call it prove, but what it is your dough puffing up. A puffed dough is not going to be a dense, heavy brick loaf at the end. It's going to take on the gas, puff up, and make a nice light bread. You need to build strength in your dough, and you need for your dough to puff. If it doesn't puff up, it's going to be solid as a rock. You need puff. Yeast puffs up your dough as long as you've worked it nicely and your yeast is okay. That will happen at room temperature, that will happen in warm temperatures, that'll even happen slower at a cold temperature, but it will puff. The gas created by the yeast in combination with the strength of your dough creates puff. If your dough is taking a while to puff, just leave it a little bit longer. A puffed up dough makes a nicer bread than a non-puffed up dough. I think we've established the puff. Let's move on. Principle number 3 is structure. Can you read that? It's a little bit dodgy. Structure. By now you might realise that all these things are interlinked in some way. They all rely upon each other, and that's the whole point of the game. You got all 4 linked up together. You got all 4 principles working in your favour, and you've already won the game. It's easy. Structure is important. If strength is the elasticity, the strength inside of your dough to be able to hold all the gas, then when the yeast does its thing, the strength holds the gas and the dough puffs. A puffed dough is a win. However, you'd like it to puff up nicely, right? In the right direction where you want it to go. We have to build structure to make that happen. Structure is everything you do after you knead the dough all the way until it goes into the oven. I'm talking about shaping it nicely to put it inside of the bowl, building the tension the right way, like a dome for it to puff up. I'm talking about taking it out of the bowl, pre-shaping it, shaping it, folding it deliberately in order to create the structure so your round cob loaf comes out like a round cob loaf and not like a, or your baguette comes out like a baguette, and when you cut it you get the nice round cross section. You have to build structure in order for the puff to work with the strength to puff it up in the right way, the way you intended, to make it come out the shape that you wanted. If you notice in the shaping videos I've done, we are folding in a deliberate manner to create the structure in the right way, to create the tension across the top of the dough so it rises up the way we want it to, so it busts open on the top the way we wanted it to. This is what we do. This is what we do with the folds deliberately, shaping deliberately in order for it to come out looking just the way we wanted it to come out. Number 4 is a big deal. Principle number 4, the link between them all. All of these are intertwined, but number 4 is a big deal, and it's the easiest part that we need to do. Are you ready? Bang! Time. The principle of time. If you've been following this channel for a while, you'll know that I bang on about time the whole time. And now I realise I've given away the 4th principle, and you can quite happily turn off YouTube and go off and do whatever you want to do, knowing the 4 principles. But wait until the end. Give me a bit more of your time because there's a very important thing I want to talk about that links everything up. Everything. Without time, you can do none of this stuff. You need time for the dough to be able to do what it needs to do. Remember, I said strength is made with work and rest. Rest is time. You sitting on the couch while your dough rests develops even more strength than just your kneading by itself. Puff happens over time. It has to happen over time. Yeast does its work while you are doing nothing, drinking tea. That's the magic of time. Take your time. Another word for time in this game is patience. If you want to take responsibility for that time, it's patience. It's your Patience. Give yourself a pat on the back for giving your dough time and being patient. Time brings more strength. Time allows your dough to puff up when you've built that structure in the correct way to make it rise up in the correct way. And time brings flavour. As your yeast is fermenting stuff over time, if that's a long time, it creates more and more flavour over the time, just while you are literally doing nothing at all. Without time, your dough is nothing. Your bread is dense. It tastes like nothing at all. And that's why a lot of bread that you buy in the modern day, where they take out a little bit at a time to cheapen up for you, where they speed up the process with various bits and bobs of chemicals and stuff you've never heard about in your life that you don't think is probably natural to put inside of your body, they take a little bit of the time out to make that happen. And that's why modern bread is flavourless, it's textureless, it's pointless. You need the time, which is ironic, is the most important thing. All these things together are very important, but time is the thing that you don't actually have to do. Imagine this. Imagine this scenario. For example, strength. You do that with the work that you do. Structure. You do that with the folds, the deliberate shaping that you do. Puff is down to the yeast. That's down to your yeast doing its job, puffing up, having you done both these things correctly, and time is just doing nothing. Patience on your part makes that happen because you've done the work. You've done the work. This bit just happens all by itself. Combine all these four things and you are all cool. You're making wicked bread forever, by the way. These four things give you the ability to spot inconsistencies in recipes, to spot moments where you might trip up, to spot when you did trip up, why you tripped up in the first place. And that, my friends, is where the power lies. I'm talking about straight up breads like a loaf in a tin or rolls or a bloomer, for example. I'm not going to show you everyone. We're going to talk about why we do it and how we do it, because we talk in principles here at Bake with Jack Towers. We're going to go through together the logical explanation for each one of these stages and how they link back to last week's video about the 4 key principles. After watching this video and the other 2 in this series, it is my hope that you are 100% clear on what you are trying to do with bread and what you need to do to get there. And so if you're new to this channel, the rest of these videos might make a little bit more sense to you. Wow, that was long, wasn't it? Ready? I wonder if this bit is getting a bit tedious. So here we are, 6 stages. We start up here at the start and we finish down here at the finish, but actually we don't finish at the finish because there's a secret stage number 7, which is probably the most important of them all. Stage number 1 is mixing and kneading. So the first thing we do, having already weighed out your ingredients, is mix them all together because we have to. Kneading the dough is actually key principle number 1, building strength. We apply physical energy to the dough, working the gluten and making the dough strong, so that when the yeast does its work later down the line, creating gas inside of the dough can hold all that gas and puff up. I give my dough, as a rule, 8 minutes of gentle kneading. I feel like that's enough. It's the same as I do it at home, it's the same as I do it in class, and it's the same that everybody does it in class altogether. 8 minutes kneading gently, 3 minutes resting, and then we look for the 5 telltale signs that our dough is fully kneaded. When I'm happy that my dough is ready, I will then ball it up, put it back into the bowl, and leave it in there for stage number 2. Rest. This part is easy. We do nothing. Our dough rests, and so do we, and here's why. Over the time that dough is resting, things are fermenting. The yeast is fermenting the dough, and so creating flavour. Also, that gluten that we're developing so much in the mix and knead stage is developing even further just sitting in the moisture, and so we get even more strength. As we discussed last week, this is the magical time. This is the magic of time. It does it all by itself. Don't skip this part because the final bread won't rise up properly. It won't have the right structure and it won't have the right flavour. The final bread won't be nice and puffy and chewy. It will be strange and a little bit crumbly. 2 main priorities at this point are the following things. You want to avoid drafts. That means covering up your dough. A light dust in the flour, a cover, perhaps a cloth. Or if you're really trying to avoid drafts, and you live in a drafty place, put it in a cupboard or put it in a cold microwave or put it in your oven when it's turned off, something contained itself to avoid drafts so it doesn't dry out on the top. Your second priority is consistent temperature. It doesn't have to be warm, it just has to be consistent. My kitchen most of the time is around 21 degrees. In fact, it pretty much always is 21 degrees. If we're in a heat wave, it might go up to 23. Ooh! Seriously, between 20 and 25 is where my kitchen is normally at. If it's warmer, it's gonna puff up faster. If it's cooler, it's gonna puff up slower, but we don't change the temperature or mess about with it. The best thing to do is leave it somewhere consistent temperature. That's the safest thing you can do. I normally rest mine for around about an hour and a half, but minimum, I would say is an hour. Any less than an hour, and I feel like you're compromising too much in terms of flavour and texture of the final loaf. Moving on to number 3, knock back. Okay, if you know me, you'll know that this is the bit that I don't really do that way, and I'll explain exactly why in a minute. But before I do, I'll talk about why we do this bit in the first place, what's the point of it, and the way that you've probably seen it happen elsewhere. This knockback stage is about structure, building structure, which is key principle number 3 from last week. Traditionally, we mix and knead the dough, we rest the dough, it puffs up, and then this is the part that you've seen on the TV. A dough will have all the gas removed from it by punching it down with your fists. The reason for that is to degas the dough, tightening up the structure, making it firm so you're able to do number 4, shape nicely, building tension in the right place so that in stage number 5, prove it will puff up nicely with no weak areas that might be a little bit more gassy than the other areas. You're starting back from 0 here, meaning the second time it puffs up, it will come up bigger, better and stronger than ever before. It's a really important stage, but I don't like to punch my dough back down my fist because I believe in love and hey, chill out. Instead, I favour the pre-shape, which we've spoken about before. Hold on. There's a dog howling really loudly next door. I hope you can't hear it. That'd be a shame. The aim of the knockback and the pre-shape is the same in that we are degassing the dough, tightening up the structure, ready for the shape. But we're doing it in a much more gentler way, a more controlled way with love, and that's just the way I prefer to do it. This stage, incidentally, is where you would divide the dough if you are making multiple loaves or rolls, for example. You would divide it here. You would knock it back and then divide it, or you would divide it and then pre-shape each piece. Let's move on to stage number 4, which is no longer a surprise, shaping. This is another contribution to key principle number 3, which is building structure. This is the part where we turn our knockback dough into the shape of a bloomer or a tin loaf or a batard or a rolls or whatever it is you're making, but it's not as simple as just pulling a piece off and rolling it into a log. You have to fold it in a deliberate manner, shaping it up, rolling it up sometimes, building strength, building structure, building tension in the right places for it to keep hold of that shape while it puffs up for the second time before it hits the oven. There are loads of ways to shape things up. You'll see them all over the internet, on Instagram and here on the Bake with Jack YouTube channel, but they're all doing the same thing. They're all building structure, they're all building tension across the top in order for it to hold a nice shape during the proof. Once you understand this principle, you can take it in your own hands and do it however you like. Moving on to stage number 5, the proof or the proof. I don't know how to spell it and I don't really care. Whatever you want to call it, the second rest, the final rise, I, to be quite frank, could not give a toss. This is the part where we let it puff up before it hits the oven, which is important because if we baked it straight away, it would be very dense and very strange. Remember, we degassed it here and here, so now it is a dense dough with minimum air. It's no longer a puffy dough, and in order to make a nice, light, yummy, delicious, fluffy bread, we're going to want to leave it this second time round to puff up again before we bake. This is key principle number 2 in play. Once again, we let the dough rest, it puffs. It's the principle of puff. That puffed up dough gets baked and we have puffed up bread, nice and light. The amount of puff you need depends on what you are baking and how you intend to bake it. That how you intend to bake it is a really important thing, and we'll go through that that in another video later down the line because it's fascinating, but in the meantime I'll leave a link underneath here to a blog post I wrote a while ago so you can get your head around the idea. This stage you need to take care of your dough in a similar way to what you did in this stage. You need to keep it free from draft summer with a consistent temperature. You don't want a skin to form on the outside ideally, unless you are stone baking, in which case you want that skin on the outside to form, and this once again is another subject for another time. For now, for this video, we let it prove and puff up, ready for the final bake to make sure it's light and yummy. So stage number 6, which is not the finish, and you must already know by now, is bake. I don't know if I have to go through why we do this bit, but I'll go through it anyway. Baking turns your dough into bread. It turns dough into bread what you can eat. It turns dough that you can't eat into bread what you can eat. When baking your dough, consider the size of it. A whole loaf in a tin, for example, I'll give a full 40 minutes in the oven. And for smaller breads like rolls, I'll give them about 15. This is all practice down to your oven again, which is why I'm not showing you, and it's why it's another thing that I can't give you straight up times and temperatures for. But consider the volume of the dough that you're baking at the time. Small breads take less time than big breads. That's the rules. And like I said at the beginning, baking is not the end. There's a super secret number 7 part of the puzzle, which is this. Learn. When I say learn, I'm not saying sit down and watch another 100 of my videos. I'm saying take a look at what you've done. If your bread come out nice, celebrate that fact. Have a look at it. See what's going on. Is it baked through to the middle? Is it as crusty as you'd like? Taste it. Is it nice? Write it down in a diary. Keep yourself a book with everything that you did up to this point. Everything that you did at every single stage, the temperature of your room, and how the bread was in the beginning. I can't stress that point enough. I used to, in the olden days, take a lot of notes on the recipe I was doing, the process, the method, the temperature of the room, but I neglected to write down the all-important thing, which was, hey, what was that bread like in the end? The result of that book is just a load of pointless recipes that nobody knows if they're any good or not. So celebrate your triumph. And when I say learn, don't pick apart the tiny details. Some people send me emails like, how come the bit underneath my bloomer is a little bit crinkly? Like, really? It's a triumph. If it puffed, if you can make a sandwich, if it tastes nice, it's a triumph. Everything else can be tweaked along the way once you learn and practice, because practice is learning at the end, as long as you do number 7. Does that make sense? Practice and learning is the same thing. It's all intertwined. It's just a whole big loop. Do it and learn from it. Do it and learn from it. Rinse and repeat. That's it. Listen, this video series has been quite fun to do. It's been quite fun to get all my thoughts together. Yes, I know there's stuff that I haven't said. I know there's bits that I haven't said, because if I did say them all, this video would be unbelievably long. There is infinite. The bread making process is infinite, which is why there's been 12 videos up to this point of me talking about bread and touching on a little thing. And there's tons more to come in the future. It's infinite what we can do, and that's the whole pleasure of it. It's an evolutionary process, and I hope this 3-part series has helped you piece a few of my bits and bobs together that I've spoken about previously.